Hey, Changemaker! Welcome to Learning for Good, the only podcast that teaches nonprofit leaders how to leverage training to drive performance, improve capacity, and fuel their mission impact. Do you ever feel like your nonprofit is growing, but your people just aren't keeping up? Or like you're fixing the same problems over and over? Do you wonder how to build confident, capable staff who know how to lead, not just execute? If we haven't met yet, I'm Heather, and I know how hard it can feel to get people to do what's expected of them. Trust me, I have 3 kids. I've tried telling people what to do and how. I've tried the traditional training approaches, and I realized that just doesn't work. And that's when I started researching what does work. Now I help mission-driven leaders use learning to drive performance, build capacity, and make change that lasts. And I'm sharing it all on this podcast. So block your calendar, turn off your Teams or Slack chat, and let's dive in. It's Learning for Good. Srividya Kumar is a learning design leader with over 28 years of experience helping organizations solve real performance problems through thoughtful, outcome-driven learning solutions. As co-founder of Learnnovators, she has led the creation of over 15,000 hours of learning content for clients across 5 continents and more than 60 languages. Her work has earned over 60 international awards and delivered measurable business impact, from saving 17 million rupees at one organization to driving exceptional learner engagement at many others. Vidya's writing appears on the Learnnovators blog, e-learning industry, and LinkedIn. Her Udemy course, The Absolute Basics of Instructional Design, is a go-to resource for both newcomers and experienced professionals. She regularly leads instructional design workshops for practitioners at all levels. Vidya is also the host of the Learning Plus podcast, where she speaks with thinkers and doers who are reimagining learning for today's world of work. Whether it's solving complex performance challenges or exchanging ideas about the future of L&D, Vidya brings deep expertise, practical insight, and an unwavering belief in the power of learning to make a difference. Vidya, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I am so excited for our conversation. I know that you do a lot with scenario-based training and creating those scenarios and helping other people figure out how to create great scenarios. And I really do think this is a skill set that we all need to get better at, because scenarios are such a helpful tool in learning.
100% agree.
So before we jump in, it's one thing for me to read your bio. It's something else to hear in your own words, your own experience, what your career has been like. So tell us a little bit about your career journey. How did you get to where you are now? You're doing a lot of great stuff all across the world.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you I had a grand plan or something like that. But like most people in L&D, I kind of stumbled into it. I started off as a technical writer in the late 90s. At that time, instructional design and even e-learning were not terms that I'd heard of. So I like figuring things out and, explaining them clearly in a way that's helpful. And for a long time, I was happy doing just that. And the fact that I got to learn new things every day kept me excited. That's one of the benefits of being on the vendor side of L&D. One day you might be unpacking the science behind skincare ingredients. And the next you're trying to understand the ideal mix of concrete for construction. And the third, you're trying to figure out why this insurance product is better than its competitors. And it goes on and on. It's always an interesting mix of projects and a ton of variety in what you're doing. But eventually, I realized what I really got interested in was not just content, it was change. Why people do what they do at work, what gets in the way, and how learning can support better decisions or actions. So that's what I do these days. My work revolves around solving real workplace problems. Sometimes that means designing scenarios. Sometimes it could just be a job aid. And sometimes it's just having a very honest conversation with a stakeholder about what's really needed. I host a podcast, like you said. I host a podcast called Learning Plus, where I get to talk to very smart people doing interesting work in L&D. It's one of the most energizing things I do. So yeah, this is what my career journey has been like.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you, like you said, you fell into this career. I found that to be true for so many people in learning and development. And it is so interesting what a variety of projects we get, what types of things we're working on, and then the types of deliverables can be pretty different from project to project. And so there is just this variety that you get that keeps it interesting across the course of your.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for a very long time, I was just so focused on doing that. So it's like, every day is so new, so interesting. You're learning something new. And I would get a kick out of SMEs telling me, you're ready to join our team. So you would just learn that content very well, and you would basically try and explain it in a way that made sense. But yeah, learning design came much after that. But once that change happened, there's no going back. It's not just content, it's about whatever change is happening. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Could not have said that better. So today, I know you do a lot of different things, but today we're talking specifically about designing training scenarios. And I'm really excited for this conversation. So before we get into some of the nuts and bolts, when we say scenario, what do we mean by that? Can you help us define, just so we all have context? What do you mean when you say scenario?
Sure. So for me, a scenario is a made-up real life situation where learners have to make the kinds of decisions they would face on the job. It's something like, here is the situation, here's what is at stake, what would you do? And that's the big question for me. And that is where the shift happens. Not what do you know, but what do you do? And ideally, it reflects the kind of messy, imperfect reality that people actually have to deal with in their work, where the answer is not always obvious. And doing nothing can also be a choice, right? So you could have multiple options and all of that stuff. The correct answer, it could be that there's no correct answer. There could be multiple correct answers. There are shades of correct answers. And there are times when you end up not doing anything as well. So that could also be a choice. What I like about scenarios is that they shift the focus from knowing and understanding to doing. They nudge people to slow down and think, what are my options? What might happen if I choose this over that? And sometimes they hold up a bit of a mirror as well. So I've seen people go through a scenario and say, oh, wait, that's exactly what I do. And maybe that's part of the problem as well. So yeah, that's a scenario in a nutshell for you.
Yeah, I love that. The shift from knowing to doing. It's really cause and effect and putting them in a situation that they might see in real life. So when is a good time as a learning designer? When is a good time to use a scenario? Are there certain topics or delivery methods or other things that lend themselves more to scenario-based training?
Absolutely. Scenarios really shine when we want learners to practice decision-making, to practice judgment. Not what you know, but what would you actually do in the situation and why? So if we had to take an example, imagine a manager notices that a usually high-performing team member has missed a couple of deadlines, seemed distracted in meetings, and is probably less responsive than usual. Accountability training might tell you that you need to have a conversation with the team member. But probably the manager knows that something personal might be going on with that colleague, but they're not sure what. A scenario could actually walk them through that situation. There are multiple decisions to be made. Do they ignore it for now? Do they check in casually? Do they schedule a more formal one-on-one? Every choice has implications for trust, for support, for team dynamics. And the point is not to just get it right, but to help them think through the real-life complexity of managing with empathy and accountability as well. Another example from the nonprofit world. Say you're a program officer reviewing 2 grant applications. One has strong metrics and polished reporting. The other one has deep community trust. The data is not there to support a decision. A scenario can help surface the kinds of tension that can happen here. Impact versus relationships, reporting versus lived experience, and whatever other factors you would consider in making a decision in selecting grant applications. So that's where a scenario, I think, really adds value. They reflect that messy middle of the real work. They make people pause, think, and sometimes realize this is what I would normally do. And maybe I need to rethink that. On the flip side, to answer your question, scenarios are not very helpful when the goal is to simply transfer knowledge, right? There are situations like that, if somebody needs to learn how to fill out a reimbursement form or follow a step-by-step process, a job aid is probably a better use of their time. So you don't want to use a scenario. You don't want to overload them with a scenario or even the instructional design process with creating an elaborate scenario for that. So that is probably where a scenario is not very helpful. And as for format, it can be very flexible. You can use scenarios literally anywhere, e-learning, workshops, coaching, whatever it is. It's less about the medium and more about giving people a chance to think in context.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like how you're referring to it as the messy middle, because it really is. It's great for situations where you really just need them to think critically or differently and have them, like you said, it surfaces that tension and allows them as the learner to navigate that situation and learn from their own decisions, the judgments they're making. So I really like the messy middle, how you're referring to that. One of the things that I found with creating scenarios is that they can be a little bit challenging, maybe is a better way to say that, to create, because it's hard to create a scenario that isn't too easy to simplify and isn't too hard. There's not too much going on that it becomes a distraction.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to keep it within the context of what that learner's day-to-day would be. Because if you start throwing in details that make sense to you, but they don't make sense to that person's context, then the scenario is no longer relatable for that person. So how do you create scenarios that are realistic and relevant for whatever audience you're creating?
I think you've partially answered the question. The key word here is context. It starts with understanding the real world context of the learner. What decisions do they have to make? What pressures they are under? What success or failure actually looks like on the job for them? So I start by asking a lot of questions. I talk to people in the role, not just managers, not just the stakeholders. I look at call transcripts, emails, WhatsApp messages, Slack messages, whatever gives you a window into how people actually think, talk, and work, right? Because here's the thing. If the scenario doesn't sound like something that could happen on a random Tuesday at work, it's not going to land. Learners will either try to, game the right answer or they will tune out altogether. That's exactly like what you said, right? It could be relevant for us as learning designers, but it could not be relevant for the learner. So we need to make sure that it's absolutely relevant for the learner and they need to go, oh, this is a situation that I face regularly, or this is something that I would do, or something like that. So once a client told us, we want better collaboration across departments, which sounds great, but it's also really vague. So just to give you an example, we dug deeper and found that the real issue was this project teams were constantly getting last minute requests from sales, and they didn't feel that they could push back. That tension between being a good team player and protecting your team's capacity, that's a candidate for building scenarios. So we built a few around that. An example is where a project lead gets an urgent request from a sales colleague who says, it'll just take a few hours, and there's pressure to deliver. Now the learner has to decide, do I say yes? Do I negotiate a timeline, loop in my manager, or whatever? So that is where the realistic thing comes in, and it's absolutely relevant to the learner, because we're not just saying in a vacuum that if you get a request that your team cannot deliver, you have to just say no, learn to say no. That's not what it is. How do you navigate that situation where you don't want to lose that relationship with the sales team? At the same time, you take on a request that you know that you're able to deliver, your team can deliver without putting too much pressure on yourself and the team. So that is the context that we have to put in the scenario.
Do you wish you could connect with other nonprofit learning and development leaders? I know what it feels like to want someone to bounce ideas off of and to learn from, someone who really understands you and your work. Imagine if you could have a simple way to meet people in the field, ask questions, and share information. That's why I created the Nonprofit Learning and Development Collective, where nonprofit L&D, talent management, and DEI leaders can connect with each other quickly and easily in a virtual space. When you join this community, you will walk away with a new, diverse, and powerful network and a sounding board for your staff development needs. So if you're ready to exchange ideas and collaborate with your peers, come join the Nonprofit L&D Collective.
Another example where a nonprofit client, that I was working with said, we want a scenario to teach inclusive communication. Again, at first glance, it sounded pretty clear, but in practice, it was quite fuzzy, right? What do you mean by inclusive communication? So, inclusive in what context? With whom? What tends to go wrong? Who are the people who are involved? And once you dig in, you find that there's a pattern which is going on. In this case, there was this program staff who facilitated community meetings with multiple stakeholder groups, youngsters, elders, external people, funders, and so on. And someone would raise a concern that other groups felt uncomfortable addressing. The staff was not sure how to respond in the moment without derailing the meeting or, alienating the other groups. So that's where a scenario came in, right? And that became a basis for the scenario. A young participant challenges a program decision during a community meeting, and the learner has to decide how to respond, acknowledge and move on, or invite further discussion, or redirect for later conversation in a more private setting, or whatever. And every choice has ripple effects on trust and how the other participants react and momentum for the meeting itself and so on. So you put in all those decisions in the scenario, and that's when it becomes really realistic for the learner. And you have them engaged on making those decisions and seeing the consequences of their decisions play out within the scenario itself. So yeah, that's what makes a scenario land. It's not just the generic goal of collaboration or inclusion that you would normally have. And it's definitely not about crafting drama. No, you don't want to manufacture drama and add it to the scenario, but it's about like the specific lived tension that people actually have to navigate in their day-to-day work and life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I talk a little bit about how learning and development can help drive organizational and individual change. I talk a little bit about scope and how a lot of times our stakeholders come to us with a very large scope in mind, and it's our job to help simplify that scope to find the actual change that needs to happen. And I think you're saying that a little bit, and that it's not collaboration, but this particular situation, it really is simplifying. But what that you're adding to that is that it's also being very specific about what that change needs to be, and then creating that scenario around that specific change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think specificity is one of the most important things, right? Yeah, because your decisions in real life do not happen in a vacuum, right? They are very specific and they have very real consequences, right? Good or bad. I'm not talking about bad consequences alone. Good and bad consequences. And you need to see through the consequence and see the impact of your decision on those consequences and the ripple effects. Then you will know, okay, fine, these are decisions that I can take. And this is the spectrum of decisions that I have available with me, and how it can play out in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious to know, are there things that we should avoid when creating scenarios?
Absolutely. There are a few red flags I always look out for. The first and foremost thing is you want to avoid not having any real decision to make. I've seen a lot of such cases. If the scenario does not involve a meaningful choice, it's not really a scenario. It's a story with a quiz tacked on, right? So a lot of times I see cases where you tell a very elaborate story, beautiful story, and then finally at the end of it, what is the right decision to make here? No, that's not what it is, right? So the scenario is basically to give enough context for the learner to actually make a decision in that context, right? So learners need to be in the driver's seat, not just asked to recall what they learned in the course that preceded or whatever. The second thing is too little context. It's kind of related to the previous one. Real decisions don't happen in a vacuum. People consider relationships, timing, competing priorities, plus the principles of what drives the decision in that context. If the scenario gives no background or nuance, it's not going to feel real, and the learner's choice will not feel real either. Third, situations that aren't believable. If characters are one-dimensional or the situation feels scripted, learners are going to disengage. They will think this would never happen here, and the learning moment is lost. And so is the learner's attention and trust. So this has ripple effects on the engagement factor that we always talk about. And fourth, answer choices that are too obvious. if there's one perfect option and two terrible ones, it's not a thinking exercise. It's more like a checkbox. In the real world, people rarely get clear signals about what's right. The learning lies in navigating those shades of gray. So we want to keep those. So these are 4 things that come to mind. But here's a tip. Build scenarios around real tensions. If it makes the learner pause even briefly to think about what they would do, that's when you know you're on the right track. So yeah, if you do that, you're good to go.
Yeah, those things make a lot of sense to avoid. I appreciate you sharing that. But you brought up something else for me that I want to just touch on. So you mentioned like avoiding situations that aren't believable. You don't want characters that aren't relatable or things that feel too scripted. And part of that is understanding that context and putting the scenario in that context. That's also just bringing that scenario to life. So how do you bring scenarios to life? Are there specific things that you try to include, like visuals, or what does it look like? How do you bring the scenario to life?
Definitely. This is an idea that I feel very strongly about. And I get into a lot of situations where I get into arguments with people, clients, stakeholders, even my own team, right? There's a general misconception that bringing a scenario to life means making it more flashy. Or graphics, make it 3D, throw in some augmented reality, right? The moment you do all that, there's an idea that the scenario has come to life, right? I'm not saying that these are not useful. They can absolutely be useful, especially when the environment itself is an integral part of the learning. But these are not always necessary. And the trick lies in understanding what is necessary and what is not. But the most important thing for a scenario to come to life is it's much simpler than that. It means making the situation feel real, like something that could happen in the learner's world. To me, there are 2 things that matter most: language and detail. With language, I try to write the way people actually speak, not how we wish they spoke in an ideal world. If the dialogue sounds like a policy document, or even how you would write an essay with perfect grammar and all that, learners can absolutely disconnect. But if it sounds like that Slack message you got this morning, they're suddenly leaning forward and paying attention. That said, not every scenario is about language, we know that. Sometimes it can be a task-based decision, like choosing the right response in a system, or deciding what to flag in a report, or whether to flag something in a report at all. In those cases, clarity matters more than just the conversational language. The important thing is to remember, make it as realistic as possible. The goal is to avoid confusion and create a clear path to the best decision in that moment. Then we have detail. And this is where I see a lot of scenarios either overdo it or fall short. Sometimes we end up adding too little detail. Sometimes it's too much detail. So it's important to know where to draw the line. Too little detail, the learner can't engage meaningfully. Just to give you an example, I've seen scenarios that go something like, you're meeting with a colleague, what do you do? Who's the colleague? What's the issue? Why does this matter? What is your relationship with the colleague? Without all these details, the learner is just guessing. They cannot make a decision without really understanding the context behind who the colleague is, what the situation is like, and so on. So that's too little detail. At the same time, too much detail is unnecessary and can cause cognitive overload. I've seen scenarios that come with a cast of like 5 characters, 3 email conversation threads, a bunch of lengthy documents. By the time you get to the decision point, you've already lost the thread. The sweet spot is just enough to create friction. A vague calendar invite from an absent-minded colleague, an offhand comment from your toxic boss, a funding deadline which is looming with not enough time to do what's necessary. So these are things that create enough friction, enough tension for you to be able to make a decision in that moment, and things that the learner should be able to identify with, things that they see happening in their day-to-day life. Not every learner, but you see the group of learners, the audience, right? That's where the analysis would help a lot. These cues help the scenarios get anchored emotionally so that the learners can feel the tension, and so they feel that the decision making is real and they find meaning in that activity, right? And that's where learning happens. Visually, I like to keep things minimal, a clean layout, imagery where it's relevant, but nothing that gets in the way of the decision. And whether it's a branching scenario or a single choice, the goal is the same. Put people in a situation that feels familiar enough to be real, but challenging enough to make them pause and think, what should I do here? Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I've done some scenarios that have some of the flashy stuff. I would say the majority of scenarios that I've done have been less flashy and more, like you're saying, just really relevant, down to earth, exactly, how they speak with the right details, some sort of emotional pull, and just really clean. And that can work really well, even without all the flashy stuff. So I appreciate you sharing that. So you've given us a lot of great information about when to use scenarios, how to create them, things that we should avoid. For people who are just starting out, this is going to be an amazing episode for them. But also, they might need just like those first one or two steps to take. So for anyone who's just starting out with scenario design, what advice do you have for them?
Don't start with the decision. Okay, I think this is one of the biggest things I can say to somebody who's in the early stages of scenario design, because I see people getting caught up in this a lot. I think it's because we are hardwired as humans, we are hardwired for stories, right? The moment you say scenario, they become very excited. They become like mini novelists, plotting their plot and their characters. That might eventually work out in the end, but you'll end up with a lot of unnecessary fluff. Instead, start by asking yourself, what is something people struggle with in the real world related to the topic that you're covering? We talked about a few examples. What's something that people struggle with respect to this particular topic? A moment where they hesitate, where they make mistakes, second guess, or act on autopilot. That is where your scenario lives. And then you build out from there. Build out the context just enough to make decisions feel real. You don't need a full backstory, just enough for the learner to think, yeah, I've been there and this is important for me. I need to make the right decision, or I need to check out all the decisions in the scenario so that I see the consequences of these, and then I can make better decisions in future in real life when I go back to, work, right? And don't get caught up in visuals or in tech too early. A single well-written scenario with a thoughtful debrief often has more impact than an elaborate branching exercise that misses the mark. So that's very important. If you're starting out, start with mini scenarios. This is something that Chris Tucker talks about, and she talked about it on an episode on my podcast as well. So start with scenarios. So it does not get overwhelming. Simple context that's realistic. We talked about it. And some decision-making options. Make it well-written, simple, and realistic decisions and consequences. So it lands well. You don't start off with a very elaborate branching exercise and then you get tangled in a messy thing, right? Also, test it. Show it to people who actually do the job. If they say that's not how it works, do not try to defend it. Fix it. So this is what I would say. Scenarios aren't about clever writing. They're about creating just enough tension to make people stop and think. And if the learner walks away, still turning that moment over in their head, even a little, I think you've done something right.
That is such great advice. And I'm glad you threw in test it there at the end, because that's a step easily overlooked and we haven't talked about it yet. So I'm glad you threw that one in as well for us. Vidya, you've given us so much information today, and I just know this is going to change the way people think about scenario building and hopefully encourage people to try it if they've never tried it before. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Start with the decision, not the story, not the tech, not the visuals. What great advice. Vidya has made designing scenarios approachable, and I hope that you will give it a try in a future project. And if you do, will you let me know? I'd love to hear from you. If you're in a nonprofit, come join us inside the nonprofit L&D Collective, where we have conversations like this. And if you're not in a nonprofit, just send me a note on LinkedIn. I want to hear how this episode impacts you and your work. I'll see you next time on Learning for Good.
Hey friend, was this episode helpful for you? Did you like what you heard? Do you want more content like this? Here are 3 things you can do. Hit subscribe. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice. Share this episode with a colleague. This means so much to me personally. I read every review, but it also helps me learn what content you like most so I can create more of what you want. All right, turn that Teams or Slack chat back on when you're ready, and I'll see you next time on Learning for Good.